So, you want to learn how successful booktubers make videos? Well, I guess you better click off and I'll see you in the next one. Everyone else, cheers. Welcome back everybody to me making a video. Wow! And it's going to be a bit of a waffly one. So yeah, today I'm going to do the thing that I asked about recently and sort of modify something that the bemused bookworm Cleo suggested a couple of weeks ago. God, time flies. I'm going to talk about, how I make videos, and this goes in a bunch of steps. First, I'll talk a bit about, who I am, my background when it comes to thinking and stuff. Then I'll talk about, how I come up with video ideas. Then I'll go through a list of video ideas that I have not yet made. Some of them may become videos in the future. Some of them you may have heard me talk about if you're a, regular watcher a viewer of my weekly navel-gazing videos. And then I'll go through one specific example, one case study, so to speak, of how I do the video process in detail. And after that, well, I hope I'll be done. So let's get started with all of this and start with my background. Alright, so why am I doing this part? Obviously to brag with all my academic experience. No, not really. I think it's important to sort of understand where I'm coming from, because that has a huge impact on my general process of coming up with ideas, of doing videos, and so forth. And that is, of course, also a bit of an acknowledgement of, all kinds of privilege and stuff like that. Because I am fairly well educated. Whether I want to, whether it's, education that makes me successful in anything is a different question. But I've been to university for a long time. I also come from a background that is well educated. Both my parents went to university themselves. My mother even has a PhD in law. So I come from a background where reading was always part of it, where academia was always a part of it, which already, gives me a bit of a leg up when it comes to, my general way of reading books and so forth. So that's the first part. I did then study, and I studied broadly in a lot of things, right? I have technically a degree in computer science with a focus on artificial neural networks and stuff like that. I also have a background in philosophy, and we'll come back to that in a moment, and I have a unfinished bachelor's, well, I never finished my bachelor's degree in history. So that's already a lot of academia stuff. I've obviously also spent a lot of time just reading political theory and stuff like that as well. And I think all of these things come together. Now, what did I focus on in the humanities parts? Because I think mostly the humanities parts will be relevant here. Well, in philosophy, I did take courses in both aesthetics and in metaphysics, mostly, and philosophy, history of philosophy in a lot of ways. This will come up later. Aesthetics in this case is more about, philosophy about literature, about possibly having truth, knowledge and so forth conveyed through fiction, that kind of stuff, which does help me sometimes when it comes to, going slightly towards literary theory and stuff like that. This is the first part. In history, I did focus, metaphysics was a bunch of philosophy of religion, history of philosophy, which is a general good idea because you have a lot of overlaps with history. In history, however, I did focus on both ancient and medieval history and early modern. I've never really enjoyed anything that is newer than, say, the year 1800. It kind of gets boring for me in that regard, but that's personal taste. And I've obviously focused a lot on ideas of religion, faith, church history, history of, the Enlightenment, those kind of topics. And, you can do history of religion and faith and ritual and stuff like that. You can do that in ancient history. I've written a term paper on how the Theseus cult and Theseus myth in Athens changed over the centuries and millennia to sort of stay relevant in Athenian minds and adapt to the changes in Athenian politics and so forth, for example. So I've always been interested in that. So from all of that, what we can assume is I have experience with reading. I have experience with academic reading and slight, experience with academic reasoning or looking at stuff in a more analytical way. That's just something I have as a bonus from, hanging out at universities for years. That is very, very helpful. I have always been interested in religion and in faith, and those two things are not the same. They overlap from time to time. I've always had an interest in how we write history and historiography. I took a course, for example, on Thucydides, Peloponnesian War. I also took a course on Frankish history and focused on the writings of Gregory of Tours in that, for example. So I've always been interested in philosophy and history, in faith, in the structures of religion, but also in the way we write history. And obviously, writing history is all about like creating narratives, which once again also helps when analyzing, fiction in a lot of ways. So that's sort of where a lot of my stuff comes from. Politically, obviously, I'm somewhere on the broader left spectrum. I've read a lot of like theory there. I've read some Marx. I've read some other stuff in that regard. I've read some philosophy, more modern philosophy like Adorno, like Guido Bohr, that kind of stuff. So all of that's are things that are part of my background whenever I think about making videos, or, and this is the other part, of course, whenever I read any kind of book, whether it's your R.A. Salvatore novel, or it is Terra Ignota, or Dan Brown at the moment. So that, and I think it's important to understand that all these things we've done before sort of direct our ideas, or the way we come up with ideas and the way we go about ideas. Obviously, also consume a lot of like media. Mostly these days, it's stuff on YouTube, for example, a lot of like video essays, some podcasts, that kind of stuff, usually about politics and history and that kind of stuff, from a usually leftist, anarchist, and so forth perspective. This will come up later for a bunch of reasons. So that's my background, and as I said, I wanted to mention this because I think it impacts the way I think about stuff in general and the way I come up with ideas in a lot of ways. And you'll see that. So, part 2, how do I come up with ideas? So, I think there's a bunch of things that come in here, and these are once again tied to my personality in a lot of ways, right? I want to educate. It's certainly something I've always enjoyed. I taught a bunch of, tutorials and stuff at university in philosophy. I like to educate. I like to tell people about all the cool things I've just found out. It's just like part of who I am as a person. So a lot of times I read something, I read a book, or I think about books or whatever and come up with something clever, and I'm like, hey, I gotta tell everyone about this. And those are often, sort of like more meta topics than just like, hey, this book is really cool. I also do that, and those kind of videos sort of write themselves, and we'll get to that in a moment. So that's the one part. The other part is, of course, that I'm an angry activist, or would be. Obviously, activist sounds grand. It's not necessarily that, but I think that with everything I do, I try to make the world a better place. That sounds, once again, still very, very grand, but it means that if I encounter things that make me angry because I feel people are wrong, people do something dangerous, or people praise something that I think causes harm, then that makes me angry. And anger in general is a great motivator for me to do things. We will see that in a moment as well when we talk about individual books and individual ideas. So usually what happens is I read stuff, I enjoy a book, and some ideas spring into my mind, just like connecting thoughts from that book to other thoughts, to other books, and so forth. As I said, I read a lot of stuff analytically, which means I, put stuff into different boxes and categories in my brain, connect books to each other, and reference them. And sometimes this leads to like a larger idea. It's like, hey, let's do something about time travel books. Or talk about alternate histories and stuff like that. We'll come back to that in a moment. So that's one way of me coming up with ideas. The other one, as I already said, is me being angry. Like I watch someone else make a video on Booktube or anywhere else, or talk about something on, say, a Discord server or whatever, and it makes me angry. And sometimes I decide on the spot that I need to yell about and rant about it. Or sometimes I'll just like file it away, and then I encounter the same kind of take or a similar take somewhere else. And there's this like small meter going up in my head, and at some point it just like hits the bell, and it just like goes ding, ding, ding. And it's like, all right, now is the time to talk about this. And we'll talk about that in a moment as well. But that's usually how I get motivated to make videos. So that's sort of where ideas usually come from. Now we'll just go through a bunch of ideas, and then we'll go through the process of one video. So let's start with one that I think shows the case where I said, like, I just read a bunch of books and they sort of connect in my head. So recently I read a bunch of books about alternate histories, and I started out with rereading, well, in this case, reading for the first time Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, and enjoyed it, and that got me kind of thinking about alternate history novels that actually it started out with me reading Cahokia Jazz, and then reading Philip Roth, and then I had already just read two alternate history books within a very short sort of like time frame, like 2 weeks or something. I was like, hey, got me thinking about alternate histories in general, and I have read in the past other alternate history books, for example, The Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon, and Unholy Land by Lavi Tidar, and of course also The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. And that's sort of the point where I thought about it, was like, hey, let's maybe reread those three books and see if I can sort of find parallels, differences, and say something larger about alternate history books, what they say about the time in which they were written, the political circumstances, the climate when they were written, and so forth, and see if that works out. This video has not yet happened, so here's a video idea that I am working on it. In a lot of ways. I thought about maybe doing a short of review discussion kind of video for each of them individually, and then have a wrap-up video where I go hey, this is the end of Alternate History Week. This is what we learned from 5 different alternate history novels. Here's the difference. Here's the takeaways. That's an idea that I have. And this is just something that's sort of an emergent property of me accidentally reading 2 alternate history novels within 1 week or 2 weeks, and going hey, there might be something interesting to this. That's one way of doing videos. Then there is, of course, the ADHD losing control of stuff videos, right? One of those was, of course, last year's long-ass video about Arthurian literature, which kind of was exactly me doing that. It's I started out making the videos that I called Sunday School, where I wanted to talk about different ways of reading fantasy, something that I've, thought about a lot when I read a bunch of academic texts on fantasy studies and so forth. And I was like, hey, those Guy Gavriel Kane novels are perfect to do that, because especially, the Fionnavar Tapestry, those novels have all a different focus, and then you have continue with what's it called, Tigana, and you can look at sort of folklore and stuff there, because that's the folk stuff is sort of how identity and colonialism and so forth are, and imperialism are sort of negotiated in that text. So I'm hey, I can just take Guy Gavriel Kane novels and talk about these different ways of reading, different lenses to apply to reading fantasy, each with one of these novels, and that would be a really cool thing. And I started, and obviously Fionnavar has a lot of Arthurian themes in there, and then for reasons the Arthurian video kind of completely sort of got out of hand, because I realized I can't expect everyone to have a full sort of background in Arthurian mythology, and Kay does in fact use different aspects of the Arthurian story that are not necessarily part of what you might call the mainstream knowledge about Arthur, which is usually swords and stones, dying with his being killed by his son, having the weird love triangle with Guinevere and Lancelot, and that's sort of it, right? And Kay uses different ones, so I need a lot of explanation to show how Guy Gavriel Kay does Arthurian literature stuff, and then I just fell down this rabbit hole of explaining Arthurian literature, and then during that reading I came up with the idea of going well, there's a lot of Arthurian retellings, and I can do something there, which is, show these different retellings and how they, once again, connect to the times when they were written and so forth. And that's, it took suddenly 4, 6, 7, 8 weeks to make that video, because I, lost track of stuff. This is something that happens. Then we have, of course, I get mad at someone and feel I need to do something about it. Prime example for that was, of course, the video on anti-Semitism in fantasy that I did last year, where I just got really mad when I pointed out the sort of structural anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic tropes in the first law books by Joe Abercrombie, and no one saw my point, because everyone's well, but banks are evil. I'm yeah, but there's an additional layer there. Apparently people reading fantasy books are not aware of, general ideas of, structural anti-Semitism and so forth, which is how I didn't plunge into like 3 months of reading history of anti-Semitism and all of that stuff. You know, the video is out there. I've done that. Usually these are, you know, the kind of videos that start out as like a very short thing in my brain and then suddenly go in all kinds of places. So that's another way of me making videos. Then there's another example of that, me getting angry about something that triggered the idea of making a video, and that is, of course, the Sanderstorm that I always keep referencing. Like, you remember last year when I made a short video about those 2 articles about Brandon Sanderson, the one, Brandon Sanderson is Your God, or whatever it was called, on, I keep forgetting, Wired magazine, I think. And then another one came out on... God, I keep forgetting where it was. So these articles, and there was a big like brouhaha and everything, and I made a short video and got very angry about like the way people read those, and I'm like, there's something deeper going on there, and then I started reading a lot of books. I connected it to ideas that I had already in mind, which, you know, stuff about the culture industry I read from Adorno and Horkheimer, and then I went to the Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord, and I started reading and rereading all these ideas and plotting out a video on how social media, the culture industry, and so forth, all these aspects and fan studies of the interactions with fandom in the age of social media and parasocial experiences all feed into this very specific way I see the publishing industry moving forward to, and how Brandon Sanderson is a perfect sort of case study of how that works. And I did a lot of reading and research on that, and then I got sidetracked once again. That, you know, during the process I got sidetracked with that whole Arthurian video, and then I returned to it in the autumn, and then other stuff happened. So it's not yet done. It will still be happening because I think this still needs to be talked about. It just, you know, right now I just in a different headspace because yes, I have ADHD, and sometimes that makes it very hard to focus on something if there's a shinier thing happening right now. But it also grew because I had read some Sanderson books before, those being the Mistborn Era 1 trilogy and The Ally of Law. But I also owned a bunch of the others, including already most of the, what they're called, Stormlight Archives. So I thought maybe I should read them, especially with like book 5 coming out this year, and talk about them as well, because my problem is always that coming from an academic perspective, I feel like I need to have something to base my argument on. I need to cite stuff and going, hey, here's Brandon Sanderson's role in like the way publishing happens these days that I think is problematic, may lead, and that's probably me just being paranoid, which I obviously am, expecting a lot of angry Brandon Sanderson fans going like, well, but you haven't even read his books, how can you say these things? Even though obviously Sanderson's public persona has very little to do with the books that he's actually writing. But that sort of got into my head and was like, hey, I should probably read those books, maybe talk about them. Not in like as much detail as I did with like Wheel of Time, but, you know, have like a video or two about each novel and see how they all compare to each other, if there are through lines and so forth, and maybe even tie that to Sanderson's Mormon identity. Because, as we all know, faith and religion can both impact writing, just read C.S. Lewis or J.R. Tolkien, and they're kind of things that I'm like really, really interested in really, really quickly. So that's how I started preparing earlier this year with reading a lot of stuff about Mormonism, because I figured ideally I'll make an introduction video. I was like, hey, this is the stuff about Mormonism, the LDS Church and so forth you should probably know about. So we have a basis to talk about all the Sanderson books, because if I just reference the Word of Wisdom or whatever in like a later Sanderson novel, like, chances are you don't know what I'm talking about. But if I have like sort of like this chapter 0 or introduction video in the beginning, then that's what we'll do. And then I read a bunch of books about Mormonism, both the history of the LDS Church and the beliefs. I read the Book of Mormon, I read the Doctrines and Covenants, all of that stuff, and then my camera broke and the video never got made. It will still I will still try to make that video about Mormonism because it has to happen. It may just take some time because right now my brain's somewhere else. So that's another way sort of like video ideas come up. An idea about making a bunch of videos about Sanderson's writing, but also an introduction and tying that back to Mormonism. Because it so happens that there's a lot of Mormon or Mormon-adjacent fantasy and science fiction writers out there. And I've been aware of that for a long time. I thought, hey, maybe there's something more going on there. So that's something that will happen in the future. A video about Mormonism, and then Sanderson, and then finally after that, the big Sanderstorm about the interactions that social media bring to the table, how publishing changed over time, and so forth. That one will also still happen, but it also has like a lot of like theoretical background, so it just takes a while to do those kind of videos. What other videos are still out there that I wanted to make and that I have ideas about? Like, obviously, I watch other booktubers. I watch, discussions about what's going on. I've long wanted to talk about, the way we talk about book talk and shit like that. Sometimes I feel I'm maybe not the most qualified person to do that, which is why I'm holding back. Stuff like that. For example, when Bookborn and whoever, Stephen Arian, talked about the way that books are now too political or whatever, I talked about that, but there's still like the idea that social media has turned everything to shit, and that's sort of to blame, and the internet is to blame. And there's another video in there that I want to talk about how technology is not actually the problem. But I didn't want to do like two of those at the same time, so this is something that will come up again, because, I'm positive someone will complain about how the internet has ruined reading sooner or later. It's just a matter of time, and then I'll have that. I'll keep thinking about it and maybe add ideas, and that's, we will see how that goes. So that's another video that I want to make. There's obviously always more of these kind of videos, these meta videos that come up over time. So that's a bunch of videos I wanted to make, or I plan to make, or have already made. So let's continue and do the case study about the conspiracy fiction video. I've been talking about it for a while. So at the beginning, there happens me getting angry at someone. A conversation about a throwaway line where I mentioned somewhere that I think Dan Brown's books have had a harmful impact on society. And people got really mad at me. It's like, I'm going to show you how bad they are. Now, this goes back to a bunch of things that I realized. I had just reread the Illuminatus trilogy by Shane Wilson anyway for like an offline book club with friends, and I had just finally for the first time read Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco and really enjoyed it. And that made me sort of connect these three attempts, like Dan Brown's writings, Umberto Eco's writings, and Robert Wilson's writings about different kind of conspiracies, to see sort of the parallels in there. Then two other things happened. I had, for all kinds of reasons, back in the past, read The Morning of the Magicians, which is a non-fiction book about stuff, about conspiracy and paranormal activities and all kinds of craziness. It's a weird book. I had read that for like, preparation for some tabletop role-playing game stuff, because, you can get like really cool, crazy ideas from that kind of book. So that's that. I think I first found out about it in a podcast about tabletop role-playing games by Kenneth Haidt and Robin D. Laws. The Ken and Robert Talk About Stuff podcast, and they mentioned Morning of the Magicians, and it sounded cool, so I read it. So here's where sort of like my other media consumption kind of feeds into that, and there's more of that, because I also listened to the Behind the Bastards podcast back I don't know, when they did like a 6-part series on the Illuminati, because, I already had read like Shane Wilson and some other stuff, so yeah, really cool. And in a throwaway line there, they talked about like how Shane and Wilson's Illuminatus trilogy, and of course, before that, the whole Operation Mindfuck and the stuff that people like Kerry Thornley did, sort of in a way broke consensus reality and can be seen as one of the things that have led to our conspiratorial present with QAnon and all the other craziness. And at the time I just filed that away, and then when the Dan Brown thing came up, and I had already just read Foucault's Pendulum and reread Illuminatus, all of this sort of like snapped together, and like, hey, this is sort of the beginning of an argument. I can bring in like the Situationists and Guy Debord, which I reread last year for the Sanderson video, but now I can use it here. And this, I think, is why I mentioned how I did, in fact, sort of like why I mentioned my background in the beginning, because right now you can see that all these different elements from all these different parts of my interests, academic, entertainment, and so forth, in this moment sort of snap together, and I could pull from these different aspects and go like, hey, this is how stuff could work. So this is where the idea came from. It's like, hey, I want to make a larger video on like how conspiracy fiction through the last 70 years sort of mirrors our different approaches to conspiracy theories, and how conspiracy fiction in today's day and age is dangerous and harmful, because it's basically impossible to write about conspiracies without sort of furthering conspiracy theories. So that's the first part. Now, part 2 of this is, of course, the second step is reading. So I had the basic text, right? I had Morning of the Magicians, I had the Illuminatus trilogy, then I wanted to read Holy Blood and Holy Grail, which is the supposedly non-fiction book that both Umberto Eco references a lot in Foucault's Pendulum, and that is, of course, the entire plot behind the Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. So I read that one. I had never read it before in full, but I knew what it was about. I read it again, and it made me really, really angry because it's a terrible book full of anti-Semitism and other crap. But that's sort of like the next one. And then, of course, Dan Brown. And I decided to read the first 3 Dan Brown novels. 2 of them I had read before, like when they came out. The Lost Symbol I had not yet read. So that's the next part. I read those 3. So I did another reread of Illuminatus, a reread of Morning of the Magicians, a reading of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, another reread of Foucault's Pendulum, and I reread / those 3 Dan Brown novels. So now I have like my basic structure for my videos. Like, I'm going to talk about these books as sort of like the milestones along the sort of semi-historical argument I want to make. There is, of course, theoretical stuff that will come in. Once again, Guy Debord will come in. I'll reread that one in the next coming days. It's a very short book, so it goes quickly. So that's that part. Now, because this is going to be an argumentative video, I need both a structure and I need further research, because I want to, have sources for my claims about, consensus reality breaking down, stuff like that. So I started looking for literature, and the way I did that is, of course, in numerous ways. One of them is asking friends that have maybe similar interests. The other part is using my university library, just doing a keyword search, also going to JSTOR and checking for, articles on Morning of the Magicians, articles on Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and so forth, seeing what kind of stuff's out there. There's obviously other websites where you can maybe get around paywalls for, articles, or where you can find academic texts online, which, I'll not mention because that stuff's technically illegal, and we don't do illegal stuff here. But those exist, and maybe sometimes people use them as well. So yeah, I just started broadly sort of throwing my net around with mostly like looking for articles in journals and so forth, and reading those that work, then going and reading more books around that, following through their bibliographies, what sounds interesting, and so forth. I also vaguely remembered that a while ago, because one part will be sort of the switch in like New Age thought and so forth into like a more commercial way that we deal with everything New Age these days. I remember that I watched a video by the sort of leftist YouTube channel We're in Hell on exactly that kind of topic. So I went back and rewatched that and looked at, the books that got mentioned there, and picked up those books to see what works out there. So, and I started reading a couple of weeks ago, and I read a lot of books in that area. I read a bunch of Umberto Eco's essay collections to sort of further build out that thing. And that has, and this is the next part, obviously this is how I do research, I just read an awful lot. This has furthered my structure, because at the beginning I was like, well, you have situationists, surrealists, anarchists, proto-anarchists deciding to smash consensus reality or the spectacle by doing Operation Mindfuck and other sort of mimetic warfare. This, opens up the idea of parallel realities, the way we use proof or do proof and so forth kind of falls apart, and that opens the idea for it, playing these conspiracy theories straight the way that Dan Brown does. And this is how we end up with this. That was sort of like the first thought. And then I need to sort of figure out ways to tie these things together. How much of that is like sort of New Age thought? How much of that is neoliberalism kind of breaking in? How much of that is just an effect of postmodernism changing the way we view reality, and so forth? And on all these readings that I'm doing at the moment, sort of help me further layer out the way I want to structure that video. How much do I talk about individual books? How much do I talk about the effects? How much history goes into that? How much philosophical theory goes into that? And that's something that is an ongoing thing. And for a lot of times, I just read something else, read a book that has nothing to do with it. Right now, I'm rereading the Black Company series by Glenn Cook. But in the background, my brain's constantly sort of nibbling away at this. And sometimes I wake up in the early morning and have an idea, sort of like a new sort of like connection has been happening overnight, which is something that Cormac McCarthy wrote about in one of his in a nonfiction essay that he wrote recently, shortly before passing, for example, something, that kind of stuff. Sometimes I just talk to myself while taking a shower, which also really helps me working out ideas for this video. And this is where the structure is. This is right now the process where I am right now. I have sort of finished most of the reading, I hope, most of the research. I have most of the connections down of for the actual argument. And now I'm trying to write them down into a structure, more like a temporal structure, like how to do this, what to do in which, order. That's where I am right now. The next step is, of course, and this is sort of parallel happening, wild ideas. I've said this before, I always want to do more than just sit in front of a camera and drink beer. And I've long thought about ideas like using costumes, filming in different locations, going wild with the idea of adding quotes. Obviously, I can't narrate quotes because I can't read, but what if I maybe ask other booktubers or other friends to read the quotes and edit them in as like a clip with like text over it, so you can read the quote and hear someone else narrate that and so forth. How about that? These are all sort of like wild ideas that I want to do. That's sort of like the ideal video that I have in my head right now. The next part will, of course, be actually filming that thing. And that's sort of where we see how many of the wild ideas I can get away with and how many I just can't do for, budget and technical reasons. I can't do a lot of fancy editing because I'm blind. That kind of stuff. But that's the next step, recording these. I'll record these larger videos, I'll record in parts, and when I'm unhappy with a part, I just record it again and again until I have a take that I'm happy with. What I then do is I take these takes, these individuals, the ones that I'm happy with, or when I can't decide which one I'm happiest with, I have some people that I trust. Sometimes these are experts, what you might call sensitivity watchers or so forth. For example, with the anti-Semitism video, I asked people that are actually Jewish whether I said something insensitive or so forth. Depending on which part of a video it is, I'll try to find people that I trust or that have special knowledge about that. If I ever make the Mormon video, I'll ask ex-Mormon or still Mormon friends to watch those bits before I put them up, just to make sure that I get everything right. So that's the next part. Once all the parts have, been vetted by friends and experts, and I'm happy with all of them, I put them all together into a long-ass video and upload that on YouTube. And then, hopefully, I have a friend who will help me create a thumbnail, because I'm obviously not good at thumbnails, which is why this one doesn't have a thumbnail. And, I'll put it out, and then maybe 500 or 600 people watch the thing. And, that's basically my process. I think the one thing that might be interesting to talk about quickly is the costs of making these kind of videos. Usually, obviously, this is basically for free, right? I record, yes, I paid for a camera and so forth, but beyond that, Booktube is fairly cheap if you only talk about one book per video and so on. Obviously, for this one specifically, I have already spent 3 Audible credits on Dan Brown novels, which I would have not spent on them otherwise, right? Obviously, I had Foucault's Pendulum and the Illuminatus trilogy before, because I wanted to read those anyway, so I spent money on those, and they don't count for the video, but for the video, I've spent 3 Audible credits on a Dan Brown novel each, and possibly if I do something wacky, I don't know, using costumes or whatever, I'll have to get those, and they might cost money as well. That will not come in, through ad costs, ad revenue from YouTube, because that is basically minuscule. Technically, according to Google, I make something like $7 per month. So it'll take for 4 months or something like that before I even have the Audible credits back in that regard. So don't want to, whine about it. I just wanted to mention it because the more elaborate a video gets, the higher the costs, which, can feel frustrating from time to time when, no one watches them. But I still, as I said, want to change the world, and I want to make arguments, and I want to structure them well, maybe change some minds, at least from time to time, and I hope that's worth it. So yeah, now you know how I make videos. I don't think it's the best process if, you want to maximize your profits, or even if you want to maximize your output, but I'm not good at maximizing anything except for maybe like video length, so that's what we have. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. I hope you understand a bit more about like how I go about these things, where the ideas for my videos come from, and my process of going through these videos and how to do research and so forth. If you have further questions, obviously there's a comment section down there. If you have complaints, there's a comment section down there. If you want to do anything else, there's still a comment section down there. Yelling at me in the comments is obviously a good way of attracting my attention. I like attention. I hope so do you. So let's do that. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, join the Patreon. Do whatever you feel like if you want to help me out. And I'll see you in the next one, which will hopefully be about something more fun or whatever. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you around. Cheers.